I was born in 1937 and the war ended in 1945, so I would have been 8. So yes, I mean, from when the war started to when it finished, I was between 4 and 8 years of age. You understood there was a war going on, but unless something happened to you, you just accepted the situation. And the only thing that, in retrospect, some ways, things were affected, you never had the freedom because your parents were worried about you going off and playing all day, whatever, because an air raid could go off at any time. Once I can remember in one place near to us where I actually saw German fighter planes shooting, strafing people. So these sort of things went on. You know? Where we lived, there were no, you haven't got the facilities you've got today. There were no sports clubs. The biggest thing I ever did when I was young was go swimming. But I had to go, it was a bus ride, because the baths where I lived, I think, was bombed down in the war. So I had to go quite a way on a bus or a tram to go swimming. The only advantage was in those days they gave you a little red booklet which, if you were school children, allowed you to go in the swimming baths for a penny, an old penny. So it was quite cheap and it was something you could do. So that was okay, but you never had all the facilities you've got today. You never had, you know, bowling or everything else we had to do in the street. A milk crate in the street, a piece of wood and a tennis ball, we played cricket. Or a tennis ball, we played football. Or a piece of metal bent round with skates and we played hockey. Everything had to be done and made up as you went along and played in the street because you never had the facilities laid on as you have today. But it was a good life. You had what was called national service, okay, where when you were 18 you were called up to go into the army for 2 years. But if you were doing an apprenticeship, you got what they call deferment. And so I was deferred until, so they couldn't call me up until I was 20. And around about that time, the house we lived in, from where I was born, was absolutely condemned before the war. But because of the war situation, you carried on living there. And it wasn't until around about I was 20, which had been 1957, we were rehoused because after the war, London had to be virtually completely rebuilt. And you were offered new accommodation, but not in a house, in a flat. And we moved. And just before, I'd had my army medical to go into the army for the 2 years, but something went awry. And I just carried on working after that period of time until one evening I arrived home and I was indoors for a little while and there was a knock on the door and it was the police. And they said, "You are a deserter from the army." So I said, "Well, no, I'm not actually," but they said you were, so they took me to the police station and I was locked up for the night and taken to the court next day. My father hired a solicitor. I gave him all the various, details that I was still working for the same company that I always worked for. I was still paying income tax, national insurance, everything. And the case was dismissed by the judge. Before I'd finished my apprenticeship, the chap who was in charge said, you've got to go on the tools. In other words, you've got to, you're not standing watching another tradesman work, you've got to go and do it on your own, which was a good thing. It's a light that they won a contract in Gibraltar and they asked me if I'd like to go. And I said yes, and was met by one of the chaps who was working for the main building company, and we sorted out some accommodation for me to stay. And then I went up to the site, but instead of being able to start work, I couldn't do anything because I never had any materials. You then got into the situation where they employed a local chap who was supposed to be able to facilitate getting the goods from the boat up to you on the site. But when any ship came into Gibraltar, the priority was for any perishable goods. Everything else was put into a chain, and it took its time. With our situation, it arose that they said they couldn't find the correct paperwork to let the stuff leave the ship. So I sat there for about 3 months doing nothing, couldn't do a thing. And it took all that time before we got the materials up onto the site. I flew home and had a break and went back and then completed the contract. And after that, another one came up, so I went back. And another one came up after that and I went back. So from going initially for what's supposed to be about a year, I finished up in 4 years there. Well, you go up onto the beaches. Unfortunately, I'm not a beach person, but I used to go for a swim. But the beaches in the summer would get so hot that you couldn't run across them in your bare feet. And for my sins, I used to go to bullfights, which I quite enjoyed, fun enough. Could be a bit gory at times, but you know, I went to quite a lot of bullfights. The biggest culture I took back, and this was in the 60s, was Cuba Libre. It's a drink you can buy today, Bacardi rum. I drank beer, but the beer in Gibraltar was so bad that I said to somebody who'd been out there for you had people out there working for the services, but they weren't in the services, they were attached to them in a civilian way. And I got to know various people out there, and one chap, we used to go out quite often, he had a car. Because even if they weren't in the services, they were sent to Gibraltar, and what they could do, they could buy a car in this country, have it shipped to Gibraltar, but pay what the equivalent price would be out there, so it was far cheaper. But the Ministry of Defence would ship the car out for them. So they had the availability of the car to drive up into Spain or wherever, and you know, we used to do this sort of things. And I said, well, look, I'm getting fed up with this beer. So he said, oh, try Bacardi. And in those days, if they gave you, you said Bacardi and Coke, they gave you a Bacardi, you had the glass like that, 7/8 was Bacardi and the rest was Coke, because the Bacardi was cheaper than the Coca-Cola.